The noon sun beat down on Cold Pine so fiercely it seemed to burn every stone in the square. The air shimmered with heat, thick with dust, and the bitter tang of sweat and smoke. Then came the sound, iron chains rattling against wood, hooves thundering to a stop, the crack of a whip slicing through the stillness. From a wagon cloaked in dust they dragged her out. Not a bride in lace or silk, but an Apache woman, tall, ragged, her clothes torn to shreds. Her skin was hollowed by hunger and scars, yet in her dark, weary eyes glimmered a flicker of stubborn pride. She dropped to her knees under the lash but refused to bow her head. The crowd roared with cruel laughter. Children tossed stones. Women hid their faces in shame, while drunken men shouted filthy jokes, bidding on her as if she were livestock. The auctioneer slammed his gavel and mocked her strength. A bride strong as a bull, fit for any man brave enough to claim her. At the edge of the square he stood. Emmett Colton, thin, weathered, his hat clutched tight in calloused hands. Folks called him Skinny Colton, a ghost of a rancher, mocked for his silence and his frailty. He was not the man anyone expected to rise. And yet, as his eyes met hers, through the haze of dust and ridicule, something shifted. Now I ask you, what would you do? Walk away and let the cruelty of the crowd have its way, or step forward and buy back her freedom? For Emmett, this moment was no small choice. It was the first step toward a path that would change his life forever. The square in Cold Pine had fallen into a hush the moment Emmett's thin figure stepped into the dust. All eyes, once locked on the shackled Apache woman, shifted toward him, half in disbelief, half in ridicule. Skinny Colton, they whispered, the man who lived like a shadow. What business did he have standing beneath the burning sun, between a woman in chains and a town eager for blood? But before that moment of trembling defiance could be understood, his story had already been written in silence. To see who Emmett Colton truly was, you would need to follow the trail of his footsteps backward, beyond the laughter, beyond the shame, to a grave marked by two simple wooden crosses on a barren patch of earth. 10 years ago, Emmett had not been the husk of a man he seemed now. He had been a husband and a father, the owner of a modest but proud homestead outside Cold Pine. His wife, Mary, carried laughter like sunlight, and their young boy was the only sound of joy that ever filled the shack they called home. In those days, neighbors might have said Emmett's shoulders looked a little broader, his step a little firmer. Then came the fever. Malaria crept through the valley in the dead of winter like a thief in the dark. Mary fell first, trembling in her bed, her skin pale as snow, and Emmett could only watch as each day drained her of life. By spring, she was gone. Their boy followed soon after, and with him the last warmth in Emmett's world. He buried them side by side beneath a crooked oak tree, the ground frozen so hard he nearly broke his hands on the shovel. When he lowered the last handful of earth over his son's small body, something inside him cracked. From that day forward, Emmett did not truly live, he merely survived. Cold Pine moved on, as towns always do. New cattle drives rolled through, saloon doors swung wide, with fresh songs and drunken brawls. Seasons changed, crops grew, and children who had been babies the year Mary died now ran shouting through the streets. But Emmett remained frozen in that graveyard, even when he walked the fields or stumbled through the saloon. He was a man whose spirit had been buried beside the two he loved most. The people gave him a name, Skinny Colton. It wasn't said with kindness. His back had bent from years of toil, his frame hollowed by grief and cheap whiskey. He never fought back when the cowhands mocked him, never looked anyone in the eye when they spat on his boots. He moved among them like a ghost, silent, bowed, invisible, except when laughter called him out. Skinny, they said, with a grin slapping his shoulder hard enough to nearly knock him down. A breeze could blow you into the dirt. And Emmett, with his weathered hat pulled low, would nod, lips pressed tight, as if agreeing with the insult. Because in truth, he no longer knew how to be anything else. For a decade he walked that way. Dawn to dusk, tending a horse that was older than he cared to admit, plowing fields that yielded more dust than wheat, sitting by the fire at night with a bottle that burned his throat and numbed the emptiness. To the townsfolk of Cold Pine, he was a pitiful sight. To himself, he was nothing at all. Until one evening, drunk, weary, and desperate for something he couldn't name, he placed an advertisement in the local paper. A mail-order bride. The words surprised even him when he scrawled them down. Perhaps it was madness. Perhaps it was the ghost of Mary whispering in his ear. Or perhaps it was the simple human need to not sit in silence until the grave finally took him. When the paper went to press, the whole town howled. Skinny Colton's looking for a wife, they jeered. Men chuckled into their whiskey, women shook their heads, and children whispered the joke to each other in schoolyards. They imagined some delicate widow arriving by train only to discover the husband she had been promised was little more than a shadow of a man. But deep inside, Emmett wasn't chasing romance. He was chasing life itself. Any spark that might light the dead coals inside him. That was why he stood in the square that sweltering day, tattered hat in his hands, dust clinging to his boots. He had come like the others, expecting to see the woman who would walk into his silent home. He had dreamed in his own quiet way of someone who could make the afternoons feel less endless. Instead, he found a spectacle of cruelty. Chains, whips, jeers. Not a bride, but a prisoner. Not lace, but rags. Not laughter, but silence, brimming with defiance. As Emmett watched, his chest ached in a way it hadn't in years. He remembered Mary's last breath. He remembered the fever in his boy's eyes. And now before him, another soul was being buried alive. Not beneath earth, but beneath humiliation and hatred. The town cackled, throwing words, sharp as knives, beastmare savage. And as they cut her down with laughter, they cut him too. He knew what it was to be mocked. He knew what it was to walk with his head bowed, shunned, invisible. The Apache woman's suffering mirrored his own, only harsher, louder, merciless. That was the moment he realized if he turned away, he would never lift his head again. He would not just be Skinny Colton, he would be a coward, carved into dust forever. The crowd jeered louder, pressing on, and Emmett's hand trembled against his hat brim. He felt his legs stiffen, his breath falter. To step forward was madness. To stay was safer. Yet his heart thundered like hooves across dry earth. Because somewhere between the sun's blaze, the rattle of chains, and the woman's unbroken gaze, the ghost inside Emmett stirred. And what he did next, whether foolish or brave, would echo through every breath he had left to take. The square of cold pine pulsed with heat and cruelty, a living stage of jeers and mockery. Men shouted over one another, waving coins like vultures circling a carcass. The Apache woman knelt in the dirt, wrists raw beneath the iron shackles, her shoulders broad yet trembling. Dust streaked her face, sweat stung her eyes, but still she refused to lower her gaze. Emmett stood at the edge, thin as a fence post, his hat twisting in his calloused hands. For years, he had been nothing more than a ghost drifting through this town. But now every insult hurled at her rang in his ears as though it were meant for him. Savage mare, they laughed, stronger than Skinny Colton ever will be. That name, Skinny Colton, cut deeper than any whip. And with each mocking echo, Emmett's chest tightened until he could barely breathe. His heart thudded against his ribs like a trapped animal. He knew he had two choices: remain silent, as he had all his life, or step forward into the fire of ridicule. The auctioneer slammed his gavel, sweat dripping from his brow. Who will bid a bride strong as a bull, fit for a man who can handle her? Laughter exploded. Coins clinked in eager hands. A child threw a stone that struck the woman's cheek, but she did not cry out. She only straightened her spine, blood running down her face like war paint. That silent defiance struck Emmett like lightning. In her he saw no victim. He saw a mirror, a soul battered but unbroken. And suddenly, the thought of turning away felt worse than death itself. Before fear could drag him back, Emmett stepped forward. The crowd parted, stunned as the frail rancher shuffled through the dust. His knees shook, but his eyes, for the first time in years, did not drop to the ground. The auctioneer sneered when he recognized him. Well, well, Skinny Colton, come to claim a wife or just to make us laugh? The crowd howled, louder, sharper. A farmer doubled over, slapping his thigh. Look at that. The walking skeleton wants a bride. But Emmett did not flinch. With trembling fingers he reached into his worn leather pocket and pulled out a small pouch. It was everything he had savings scraped together, from years of labor coins he'd once thought might buy seed, or fix the roof, or pay for a quiet grave when his time finally came. He tossed the pouch onto the wooden platform. The metallic clink cut through the laughter like a whip crack. For a heartbeat, silence. Then the auctioneer lifted the pouch, weighed it in his hand, and curled his lip into a sneer. "Fine, she's yours. Take your Apache bride, Colton. But know this, her fate will drag you down with her." The soldiers yanked the chain, shoving the woman toward him. She stumbled her knees, buckling her feet raw and bleeding. The crowd leaned forward, hungry to see the spectacle of two broken souls colliding. Emmett stepped closer. For the first time in a decade, his hand did not tremble with shame, but reached steady toward the chains. He touched the cold iron, still stained with her blood. Their eyes locked again. In hers he found no gratitude, no plea, only a storm of despair mixed with unyielding pride. A soldier shoved a key into his palm, spitting in the dirt. Emmett slid it into the lock. With a soft clang, the shackles fell away. The marks on her wrists were dark and deep, as though the metal had become part of her flesh. He hesitated, instinctively lifting a hand to steady her, but she shook him off. With staggering dignity, she forced herself upright, shoulders squared against the eyes that burned holes in her back. The crowd erupted in fresh laughter. "Behold the perfect pair," one man jeered. "The scrawny ghost and the savage mare." Another spat whiskey into the dust. Children pointed, giggling, as if watching a circus act. Emmett's face burned, but he said nothing. Instead, he removed his ragged coat, the one still smelling faintly of smoke and sweat, and draped it gently across her shoulders. The crowd roared at the sight, but Emmett ignored them. With slow, steady steps, he guided her down from the platform. Together, they passed through the gauntlet of sneers and jeers. The laughter followed them out of the square, chasing them down the long red road like a pack of hounds. Behind them, Cold Pine buzzed with the news Skinny Colton had purchased an Apache bride. By evening, every saloon and parlor whispered of it, twisting the story into a cruel joke. The walk back to his ranch was long and silent. Two silhouettes stretched thin against the dying sun, a gaunt man clutching his hat, and a tall, ragged woman wrapped in his coat. Her ankle still bore a shackle rattling faintly with each step, a cruel reminder that she had not come as a bride, but as a human being, bought out of a filthy market of shame. Yet, in that silence, something heavy stirred in Emmett's chest. For the first time in years, he had not turned away. For the first time, he had chosen to stand. As the sun bled red behind the hills, painting their shadows long across the dust, Emmett knew that his life had shifted. He was no longer only Skinny Colton, the ghost who let the world walk over him. He was a man who had reached into the fire, and whether it burned him or saved him, there would be no turning back. And that night, as the people of Cold Pine gossiped and jeered Emmett, Colton led the woman with eyes of iron and sorrow into his lonely shack, unaware that her presence would bring the town and his own buried soul to the brink of war. The road back to Emmett's ranch stretched red with dust, the sun bleeding into the hills. Behind them, the jeers of Cold Pine still echoed, like a curse carried on the wind. By the time they reached his cracked gate, the air had grown heavy with the smell of dry grass and smoke. The small shack stood crooked against the horizon, its boards weathered and weary, much like the man who owned it. Inside, the silence was suffocating. Emmett set his hat on the table, unsure whether to speak. The woman stood tall in the doorway, his ragged coat still draped across her shoulders, her eyes fixed on the land as though measuring the distance to freedom. She did not thank him, nor did she collapse in exhaustion. She simply existed in that space, unyielding, as though daring the walls themselves to cage her. But Cold Pine was not finished with them. By the next afternoon, word had spread faster than prairie fire. The strange spectacle of Skinny Colton's Apache bride had become the town's favorite joke, and soon the curious arrived, not with kindness but with cruelty disguised as entertainment. They came in clusters, swaggering farmers, with whiskey on their breath, their wives trailing behind, with lips pressed tight, their children eager to toss rocks at the fence. "Hey there, Colton," one man bellowed, leaning against the gate. "What are you going to do with that mare of yours? She'll gut you in your sleep." Laughter rippled sharp and merciless. Another spat, a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. Or maybe you needed a woman twice your size, just to keep you warm, eh? Skinny. The children snickered, their small hands clutching stones. One struck the fence with a dull crack, splinters flying. Emmett's cheeks burned. He gripped the handle of his axe so tightly, his knuckles turned white. He had endured mockery all his life. Skinny Colton, the ghost, the failure. But this was different. This was outside his own door, with the woman he had chosen to protect standing just beyond the threshold. Still, his voice failed him. His head bowed, shame weighing down his shoulders. The laughter of the mob grew louder, emboldened by his silence. They jeered, circling like coyotes around a dying calf. Then the door creaked. The Apache woman stepped out. Her bare feet left faint prints in the dust. Her hair tangled her wrists, still bruised and raw. She stood barefoot on the cracked earth, framed by the crooked door of the shack, her broad shoulders casting a shadow across the yard. The sun caught her eyes, and they burned like embers in the wind. For a heartbeat, the mob sneered louder, expecting a scene. But she did not cower. She did not beg. She swept her gaze across them, steady and fierce. And when she spoke, her voice was low, rough as gravel, yet clear enough to slice the air. Enough. Just one word. The jeers faltered. A man opened his mouth to spit a curse, but froze when her gaze met his stare, so unflinching it turned his bravado into ash. He shifted, muttered something under his breath, and looked away. One by one, the laughter died. Children lowered their stones. Even the swaggering farmers, once bold with whiskey, shuffled their boots in the dirt. The silence that followed was heavier than any shout. The wind rustled through the fence, the only sound in a yard once full of scorn. Emmett stood frozen, his chest heaving. He looked at her, the tall, ragged figure, who only yesterday had been dragged like an animal through the square. Now she stood between him and the cruelty of the world, shielding him with nothing but her will. For the first time he understood, she was no helpless bride, no burden to be carried. She was a force, battered but unbroken. And in her defiance, she had done what he could, not silenced the mob. His lips parted, but no words came. Gratitude tangled with awe, rising in his throat and dying there. He had bought her freedom, but she had given him something greater. The unbearable weight of humiliation lifted, if only for a breath. The crowd lingered a moment longer, restless and uneasy, before scattering back toward town, muttering into their collars, careful to avoid her eyes. Soon the yard was empty, save for the two of them standing side by side in the settling dust. Emmett lowered his axe, his hands trembling. The woman turned without a word and stepped back inside the shack, her tall frame vanishing into the dim light of the doorway. He remained outside the silence, pressing on him like a mountain. His heart pounded so hard he thought it might crack his ribs. For years he had lived as a shadow, enduring the jeers of Cold Pine in silence. But today, for the first time, someone had stood for him. And it was not a neighbor, not a friend, not the town he once called his own. It was the very woman they had mocked, the one he had dragged away from chains with nothing but trembling hands and a pouch of coins. That night, long after the mob had gone, Emmett sat by the small fire inside the shack. The woman sat across from him, silent, her face half-shadowed, her eyes unreadable. The faint glow of the flames flickered over her bruised wrists and weary shoulders. She did not speak, but she did not leave either. And in that stillness, something shifted within him. For years he had been haunted by the graves beneath the crooked oak. Tonight, for the first time, the silence did not feel like a tomb. Emmett glanced at her across the firelight, the coat still draped over her shoulders. He realized that she was no longer just the woman he had purchased from the block. She was the one who had stood in his place, who had faced down a mob without flinching, who had reminded him that dignity was not measured by size or strength, but by the refusal to bow. In that moment, Emmett knew he had not merely saved her, she had saved him too. And outside, beyond the fragile walls of the shack, Cold Pine seethed with whispers plotting, waiting. The battle was far from over. The whispers in Cold Pine spread faster than sparks in dry grass. By sundown, everyone knew Skinny Colton had taken an Apache woman into his shack, and worse still, she was rumored to be the daughter of Chief Whitehawk himself. What had begun as laughter turned to restless anger. Fear twisted with hatred, and men who had once mocked Emmett now spoke of him as a traitor. That night Emmett sat at his small table, trying to mend a broken saddle strap. The room was dim, lit only by the weak glow of a lantern. Across from him the woman sat silently, her eyes reflecting the fire, her posture straight, unyielding. It should have been an ordinary evening, but both of them felt it. The hush before a storm. Then came the sound. Hooves in the distance. Shouts carried by the wind. A faint glow flickering beyond the ridge. Emmett's hand froze on the leather strap. He rose slowly, heart pounding, and peered out the window. Torches, dozens of them weaving like fiery serpents down the hill. Within minutes the yard blazed red with torchlight. Soldiers and drunken townsfolk crowded the fence rifles, slung over shoulders whiskey, thick voices, shouting curses. The wooden shack trembled under their roar. Colton, a soldier, bellowed, his voice sharp as steel. "Hand over the Apache woman, or we'll burn you both alive." Emmett's breath caught. He hadn't touched a gun since the day he buried his wife and son. But now, staring at the crowd, foaming with hatred, he knew silence was no longer enough. Slowly, with hands that shook yet steadied with resolve, he lifted the old rifle from its hooks on the wall. The wood felt heavy, unfamiliar, but right. He opened the door. The night air hit him thick with smoke and fury. Torchlight painted the yard in fire and shadow. He stepped forward, rifle in hand, his thin frame outlined against the glow. His voice, though rough, carried over the chaos. "That woman inside this home is my guest. If you want her, you'll have to go through me first." The crowd erupted in cruel laughter. Skinny Colton with a gun, one man jeered. Another raised a torch, ready to hurl it at the shack. Then the door burst open behind Emmett. The Apache woman strode out, tall, fierce, her hair wild in the wind. In her hand gleamed a small knife hidden until now. She stepped to Emmett's side, shoulders squared, eyes blazing in the firelight. The mob faltered. For a heartbeat, they saw not a ragged captive, but a warrior reborn. "Fine," snarled the soldier at the front. "You want to die with her, so be it." Torches lifted high, rifles cocked. The circle of hate pressed closer. Emmett raised his rifle. His arms trembled, but his gaze burned with a clarity he hadn't felt in 10 long years. "Take another step," he growled, voice hoarse, "and I'll put a bullet through your chest." For a moment, the mob hesitated. Then one reckless man lunged, weapon raised. The woman moved first. With the speed of lightning, she struck. Her knife flashed, and the man fell, the torch slipping from his grasp. The flames hissed in the dirt. Pandemonium erupted. Curses flew. Men stumbled back, some fired shots into the air in drunken panic. Emmett fired once, the crack of the rifle splitting the night. Dust sprayed at the mob's feet. Fear rippled through them. What they had expected was a weak rancher and a broken woman. What they faced was resistance, sharp and unyielding. One by one their courage crumbled. The drunken jeers turned to mutters, then curses, then retreat. Within minutes the torches bobbed back toward the ridge, the mob scattering into the darkness. Smoke and embers lingered the yard, scarred but unburned. Emmett lowered his rifle, chest heaving. The woman stood beside him, knife still in hand, her breath steady, her eyes like fire. For a long moment neither spoke. They had not just survived, they had stood together. But peace was not waiting at dawn. The first light of morning spilled across the valley, carrying with it the thunder of hooves. Emmett stepped onto the porch, weary from the night, and froze. On the ridge above the shack they appeared, Apache warriors, their lances and bows glinting in the rising sun. Hundreds of eyes stared down, fierce and unyielding. At their front rode a man draped in leather and beads, his hair long and streaked with silver. His face was carved by years of battle and grief. Chief Whitehawk. The woman stiffened beside Emmett, her fingers tightening around the knife. Her eyes for the first time glistened with something fragile. The chief reined in his horse and fixed his gaze on her. His voice boomed like thunder rolling over the valley. "My daughter, why do you stand beside this white man?" Silence pressed down heavy as stone. Emmett swallowed hard, every muscle taut. With one command, those arrows could cut him down where he stood. The woman stepped forward, her voice hoarse yet clear. "Because he did not turn away." When this town wanted to hang me, he cut the rope. When soldiers came to take my life, he stood with me." Chief Whitehawk studied Emmett, his dark eyes probing deeper than flesh. A tremor flickered at the corner of his mouth. He turned his gaze back to his daughter, then spoke, voice heavy with warning. "If you fall again, he will pay with his life." No cry rose from the warriors. No arrow flew. The chief tugged on his reins, turning his mount. Silently, the warriors followed their hoofbeats, fading into the horizon like retreating thunder. Emmett exhaled shakily, knees nearly buckling. Sweat dampened his shirt, his hands trembling on the rifle. Beside him, the woman stood tall, her eyes rimmed red, but she did not weep. "He knows now," she whispered, her voice low, steady. "I am not alone." Emmett turned to her. In her eyes he no longer saw just defiance, born of despair. He saw something new, fragile, dangerous, but real. Trust. And as the sun broke fully over the valley, gilding their weary figures in gold, Emmett understood the true battle had only just begun. The hoofbeats faded into the distance, swallowed by the morning wind. The valley fell silent again, but it was not the same silence as before. Smoke still clung to the air. The fence blackened where flames had licked at its posts. The little shack stood battered, but standing, much like the man who guarded it and the woman who refused to bow. Emmett lowered his rifle at last, his arms aching from the weight of it. He could still feel the gaze of Chief Whitehawk, heavy and unrelenting, etched into his chest like a brand. The chief's words lingered like a curse. "If you fall again, he will pay with his life." Beside him, the Apache woman did not move. Her face was set, her jaw tight, her eyes fixed on the ridge where her father had disappeared. She was no longer the chained figure dragged through the square. She was something more, still scarred, still weary, but forged in defiance. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of scorched grass and smoke across the yard. Emmett wiped his brow, sweat stinging his eyes. His body shook, not from fear now, but from the release of it. He had survived what he once thought impossible, standing against a mob, facing down soldiers, locking eyes with a chief who could have ended him with a single word. Yet somehow, through it all, he was still breathing. By the time the sun dipped behind the ridge, again painting the valley in red and gold, the two of them sat on the porch steps. The yard was quiet now, save for the sigh of the prairie wind and the faint creak of the boards beneath their weight. Emmett rested his rifle against the wall, his calloused hands folded in his lap. The woman sat a few feet away, his ragged coat still wrapped around her shoulders. For a long time neither spoke. The silence between them was no longer suffocating. It was steady, like a river finally breaking through stone. Emmett's gaze drifted to the crooked oak in the distance, where two wooden crosses marked the graves of his wife and son. For 10 years he had believed his life ended there, buried in the hard ground with them. But tonight, after fire and steel, after fear and defiance, he realized his heart still beat. And for the first time, he let himself speak. "I once thought my life was over," he said quietly, his voice rough from smoke and strain. "I prayed for a gentle wife, someone to bring warmth back into this house. But God didn't send me that. Instead, he sent me a trial, in the shape of an Apache bride. And through her I learned I'm still alive." The woman turned her head toward him, her eyes steady, unreadable. For a moment the fire in them softened just slightly. She gave no words, but a faint nod, small as the tilt of a shadow, passed between them. It was not gratitude, not surrender, but something stronger, recognition. The prairie wind carried the last embers of the burned fence into the night sky, glowing briefly before vanishing into the stars. Emmett felt the weight of years pressing on him, yet for once it did not crush him. It steadied him. He had stood. He had not turned away. Still, danger lingered beyond the horizon. Chief Whitehawk had spared him, but not forever. The people of Cold Pine would not forget, and soldiers rarely let a challenge go unanswered. The battles ahead would be harder, sharper, and perhaps bloodier. But for now, on that quiet porch beneath the crimson sky, Emmett was not alone. The woman shifted slightly, pulling his coat tighter around her shoulders. The bruises on her wrists caught the fading light scars that told of chains and cruelty. Yet her posture remained proud, unbroken. Emmett saw in her what he had not seen in himself for years, strength, not of the body, but of the soul. Their shadows stretched long across the dusty yard, two figures bound not by blood nor by vow but by survival. Outcasts both yet. Together they had faced down fire and steel. Perhaps that was the message hidden in the ashes. Life rarely gives what we wish for. It gives what will test us, shape us, and force us to rise. As the first stars pierced the sky, Emmett let out a slow breath. For the first time in a decade he felt something stir inside him, hope fragile but undeniable. The woman's eyes met his once more. No smile, no words, just a flicker of trust faint as dawn breaking over a dark horizon. And in that silence Emmett knew he no longer walked alone. In the end, the story of Emmett Colton and the Apache woman was not about a bride bought with coins, nor a rancher mocked as a ghost. It was about two broken souls who refused to bow, who chose to stand together when the world demanded silence. In the firelight and in the dawn, they discovered that survival itself can be an act of defiance, and that family is sometimes forged not by blood, but by courage. And perhaps that is the lesson: when one person stands beside you, the world is no longer too heavy to bear.